In this video, we are going to be looking at using an Active Directory service principal to access Azure resources. So what does this mean? The Azure Active Directory service principal is like an application user. And what we're going to be doing is getting, for example, a list of virtual machines from an Azure subscription. Now, an overview of what we're going to be looking at is just some basic application architecture options. This is just broad architectural decisions that you need to make on how it works. Some authentication options that go together with these architecture decisions. Quickly creating a service principal in the Azure portal. And then how do we configure permissions for the service principal, for example, to get access to a list of virtual machines. And we'll be using Postman to do some examples to get a token and then to get a list of the Azure virtual machines. So if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and sign up for notifications on when new videos come up. Please support our channel. We highly appreciate it. In terms of application architectural options, there's basically two main flavors. We're going to be looking at what decisions you could be making in terms of how your application would be working. Now, firstly, you may have just a single Azure Active Directory with one or more subscriptions that's associated to the Active Directory, and you would like to access the resources of these subscriptions through the REST API. So, for example, to get a list of virtual machines. And the type of things that you're going to need to be doing here is to create a service principal, to set up some roles and permissions. And once that's done and you get a token, you can do the API calls to get data back from the subscription. It can be a little bit more complicated where, for example, you could be an application or a service provider out there that provides Azure applications. You would register your service principal in your own Active Directory, but people or clients with their own Active Directories or with other Active Directories might want to use your application to get access to their resources. So again, there could be single or multiple subscriptions associated with Active Directory. You would still like to access the resource through the REST API. And the basic steps here is that you're going to be creating a service principal in your own Active Directory. And for your clients, they would need to register your service principal as an enterprise application in their own Active Directories. So there's more than one Active Directory involved here. And then the roles and permissions are similar to this, to the step on this side. And then also you'll be getting tokens and doing API calls. So let's look at the authentication options. There's in general two ways that we be authenticating. The first one is where we're going to be creating an application that can access the Azure resources, and it's going to be using its own permissions. Another way to say this would be that we are going to be using application permissions. And it's usually for applications that run as background services, without a signed-in user. Okay, and then the other option is that you're going to be creating an application and it uses the user's permissions to access the Azure resources. And this is called delegated permissions. So basically your application needs to access the API as the signed-in user. So let's go to the Azure portal and then have a quick look at how do we create a service principal. So I've logged into the Azure portal, and what we're going to be looking at now is that we're going to be creating a service principal using the Azure portal. So where you need to go is you need to go to your Azure Active Directory. Now you need to be an administrator on the Active Directory to be able to do this. And then you're going to go to App Registrations. And what we're going to be doing here is to create a new registration. And we're going to give it a name. So we're going to just say Azure Demo App. And for the moment, we're just going to leave this setting. So it's only targeted to the Cornell Heman organization or Active Directory, so it's a single tenant, and that was part of the architectural discussions that we had before. We can also create it to be multi-tenant, and it means that it can be consumed from multiple Active Directories and subscriptions. Okay, so here we can just say, I'm not going to do a redirect URI now, but if you are creating a proper application, this is quite useful when we're looking at some of the other authentication options, and we'll do that in one of the next videos. So now we're just going to say register, and what I'm going to be doing is just getting Notepad to run. Let's just get it here. And there's a couple of things I'd like to note. So the client ID is quite important. So I'm just going to copy that. The tenant ID or the directory ID, very important as well. And for this example, we're just going to go to the certificates and secrets and then create a new client secret. So for the moment, we'll just say it's not going to be expiring, and I'll just say a demo client secret. So what this does, it creates a password for us basically. Now there's more than one way. It would be better to use a certificate, but just to demonstrate how you access the Azure Active Directory, I'm going to be using a client secret. So here I'm just going to copy the secret to the clipboard, and I will be deleting this application after this demo. So you can't really do much with my secrets as this, but I do suggest that you either treat these secrets quite carefully, either using a vault of some sort of secret vault, or using the client certificates to do the connectivity. So after creating the application, if we just go back to the Active Directory, to our app registrations, we should be able to see the app registrations here. There we go. And there's the Azure Demo app. I can click on it. And if we go to the secrets, we can still see them here. Okay, so let's open Postman and then look at how we would take the next steps. So let's have a look at Postman. The first step is just to get a token. So it's quite simple. What we're going to be doing is going to https login.microsoft.com, marketonline.com, and I'm just going to put a placeholder here, the tenant ID. You can get variables from Postman, but this is out of the scope of this video, so it's easy to replace stuff when you have a group of requests that you're going to be doing. And then the last part of the URL is auth 2 and token. And then we're going to be going to the body, and we'll choose a form, xwww form URL encoded, and then there's a couple of extra parameters that we would like to send through. So the client ID is the one we've got in our Notepad file, a client secret, which we've also got there, the tenant ID is in that file, the grant type, and the grant type is going to be client credentials. Okay, and the resource is going to be https management.azure.com, and then we're just going to have a scope parameter there as well, and it's just going to be default. There we go. So I'm just going to go back to my saved details, copy the tenant ID in there, and then the client ID is the one we just created, and then the client secret. And let's see what happens if we send a request. Great stuff, we got a token back. So that's getting the token back. Let's see in the next step how we can use a token to get a list of the virtual machines. And I'll talk you through the process and also the permissions that needs to be set up before you're going to get a list of virtual machines. So in this section, we're going to be looking at getting a list of virtual machines using the Azure Rest API. And one extra piece of information we're going to be needing is the subscription ID. So if you go to subscriptions, you will see I have my Cornell Human personal subscription. I could have copied the ID from there, or I can just go to this screen, say copy, and I'm just going to add that to my notepad file. And then what we're going to be doing is going back to Postman. Let's just do that in the next video. Okay, so we back in Postman, and then we've got a token here. We are going to be doing a new request, and what we want to be looking at is the following URL. So it's https management.azure.com/subscriptions, and then we need that subscription ID that we have, and then we're going to say providers Microsoft.compute, and then virtual machines, and then we need an API version as well. I will just be using the 2019-03-01. I think there's updates that's being made to these API versions all the time, so you can just have a look at the documentation, what the latest one is, and then use that one. So now I don't expect this to work for quite a while, so let's just see what type of errors you can be getting into. Firstly, it says we're not authenticated. So how's that possible? We got an authentication token here, but we're not sending the token to the request. So if we go back to the get request here, we can go to authorization, go to bearer token, an old one, I can just paste this one in there, and then send. And then the error message changes. So it's say authorization failed, and it says we don't have authorization to perform this virtual machine read on our subscription. So although we've created the service principal and we have our subscription, what we basically need to do, so just to show you again, we go to subscriptions. Okay, we select the subscription. We're going to be going to access control, and then we're going to do add a role assignment. We're going to do contributor, and then we're going to say Azure Demo App. We can just select it and then say save. Now what we've done now is we've saved or updated the roles and permissions so that the service principal actually has access to the whole subscription. So if I go back to Postman, and I now call the same thing, let's see what happens. So it's still giving me the same message, and what I suspect is that our token is out of date, or not out of date, but it hasn't gotten the latest changes we've just made to the portal. So I'm just going to request another token. Okay, and then we can copy and paste the token, go back here and paste our new token in there. And then I'm going to do the request. And there you have it. You've got your list of virtual machines that's just come back. In this next section, we're going to be looking at the delegated permissions. So when we create a service principal, we're not going to give it permission, but the user will have permission to the resources we want to access. So the first thing I'm going to do is just go back to my Active Directory. As I said before, I will be deleting the app registrations as I'm done with them. So we're just going to click on it, go delete. I'm going to delete it. Great stuff. So let's create a new app registration, and we can call it Azure Demo Delegated. We're still going to just do a single tenant demo here, and we're going to register the application. And then we're going to do the same thing as before. So we're going to be taking the client ID. So there should be a new client ID. Copy it. The tenant ID is going to stay the same. That doesn't change. Let's generate a new secret for this guy. Okay, let's copy the secret. And the subscription will also stay the same. Okay, and then let's go to Postman and get a token. Okay, so before we continue, let's just add one more thing. So we, at the Azure Demo Delegated app registration, we just need to add a platform redirect. So we're just going to do a web example. You can choose some of the other ones, but for the moment we'll just look at web, and this just needs to be a local URL. Okay, and I'm just going to copy that and configure it. Great stuff. So now what this redirect URL does is we are going to be requesting a code from the authentication, the OAuth authentication endpoint, and then using the code we're going to generate a token. But that code needs to be returned to a website. If the website doesn't exist for the demo, that is okay, but we're going to be getting the code from the URL, and we'll look at that in the next video. So in terms of getting access on behalf of the user, I will put this URL in the description of the video so you can easily find it. But basically, once you've registered your app, we just want to have a look at what we need to post to this endpoint. So we need the tenant, which is in the URL. We need the client ID and secret. We need the response type, it needs to be code, the redirect URL, which is the same as the one we just created, the scope, and we'll have a look at where we find the scope in a moment, the response mode, it's just recommended, and the states recommended. So what I've done, I've created a small HTML file called auth.html, and you'll see the following. We're going to post some data to it. The endpoint I'm looking at is this authorize endpoint. And then I've got my client ID, the scope is the user impersonation part, and I'll show you now where we get that from the portal. The response type is code, and the redirect URI is this URL. Now, for a real-world application, it'll be an actual URL where the code will be posted to. But for testing purposes, this URL actually doesn't exist, and we're just going to see the code coming back there. So then, if we just look at the portal, just to confirm those things. So we're going to go back to our Active Directory and then app registrations. We look at our delegated application that we created there. And if we go to authentication, this is where we set up our redirect URI. And this is where the code will be posted to. And then if we go to our API permissions, and we click on user impersonation, this is where we get the scope. So now that we've created that file for Postman, I'm just going to open it. I've just got a previous one open. So you won't see anything on the screen except the submit button because all the fields are hidden. It's just going to post those fields to that endpoint. Microsoft then sees, oh, in this case, I'm already logged in. If I'm not, it'll ask me for my password. This is a new account, so it wants me to do a bit more authentication, like using Authenticator or some form of two-factor authentication, which I don't want to do right now. And then you'll see in the top here, it comes back, it says unable to connect, but I've got my code here, and that's what I was interested in. So when you're writing a real-world application, you'll be picking up that code and then automatically processing it. So now we're going to go to Postman, and we're now going to go again to the token endpoint. So here we're at the authorize endpoint, which means the user is authorizing the application to get access to the subscription via Active Directory. And the things I need to pass to it is the client ID and secret, the code, which I just received. So I'm just going to paste that in there. And the scope is the one we get from the portal, which needs to be the same. The grant type is authorization code, and the redirect URI is the same as before. If I send it, I'm going to be getting back a token. And let's just see what happens if we use that token in the exact same request to get the list of VMs. So I'm just going to paste it in there and send. Now we're getting authorization failed, and it says the client, Cornell@cornelliman on Microsoft.com, with these object IDs do not have authorization to perform action compute read. So what does that mean? So there's something wrong here. And because it's a new user that I've created on my Azure portal, so the user exists in Active Directory, but the subscription does not know about the user. So I first have to go to the subscription, and then I can go to access control. And now I can look at adding a role assignment. And I definitely want to use this user, Cornell@cornelliman on Microsoft.com, and I want to make it a contributor. I'm just going to click on it. I'm going to save. And now Cornell actually has access to the subscription. And we're just going to repeat this process quick just to get a new code and token. Because now that we've changed the settings, we just need to update it. So we're going to do the exact same thing. Submit it. Let it return. Just wait for the code. I'm just going to copy the code. It's of course very easy to get the code just from Node.js or C#. Very easy to get it. I'm going to go back to Postman. I'm going to paste my code in here. Send it. I'm going to get a new token. And if I then do the request, we get the result that we've been looking for. So this is in a nutshell how we use Active Directory Service Principals to interact with the Azure portal. Okay, so the last set of examples, what we're going to be looking at is something that's a little bit more complex than the two previous ones. So before we were only really dealing with a single Active Directory, and now we're going to be looking at multiple Active Directories. And there's many examples of this. Azure Lighthouse, if you're managing subscriptions and Active Directories for other people, or if you're just providing applications where you would like to register the service principal in your own Active Directory, and then your clients can add that user or service principal to their Active Directories. And then in this instance, we're going to do the exact same thing. So we're going to create a service principal on one Active Directory and add it on the next one, and then give it access to get a list of virtual machines. So the process is going to be create the service principal, register the enterprise application, the target ID, set up the roles and permissions, and then we're going to be getting the tokens and the API calls back. And you can still mix and match the principles we've used here. So if you want to do a application permission or delegated permission, you can do it in this situation as well. We're going to be looking at only the application permissions, and I'll leave the delegated permissions for you to experiment with. So what I have here is two different Active Directories. So the one I'm using the white theme and the other one the dark theme. So it's very easy to see that we're switching between the Active Directories. This one is called Cornell Heman and this one is called Cornell Training. So it's just two different Active Directories with different subscriptions. I've got my own personal subscription here and I've got a Visual Studio Enterprise subscription here. And what we're going to be doing is first working on our Cornell Heman Active Directory. And like before, I'm just going to delete the service principal that I created before. It's under app registrations. And I am going to delete it. So none of those secrets and stuff will be valid anymore. And then I'm going to do a new app registration and I'm going to call it Azure Demo Multi. So I'm going to call it Azure Demo Multi. And in this instance, I'm not going to do single tenant. I'm going to do multi-tenant. I'm not really interested in providing it to personal Microsoft accounts. So we're going to definitely be looking at the multi-tenant. So for other Azure tenants. And I think we'll just put for in case we need to use it. So we can just put a URL in there and then we can register it. Okay, great. So then we want to do the same things as we've been doing before. So I just want to start my notepad. And I'll bring the notepad over. So we're going to do the client ID. Oops. Yes, here is my, just want to get this back to the, I seem to have now lost my spot. Okay, so let's just copy the client ID. Okay. The directory ID is going to be the same for this one. So the client certificates and secrets. Let's just generate a new secret. Demo secret. And I'm just going to copy that secret into my file. The tenant ID in this instance. So this tenant ID is my Cornell Heman. And I will have a second tenant ID. And that one will be the one that's in black. And I've also done it in Firefox, so it's just easy to switch between them. So we'll just go to Azure Active Directory. And you'll see my tenant ID is different. So I'm just going to copy it. So the tenant ID for the one Active Directory is that. And this is the Cornell Training Active Directory. And then there's two different subscriptions associated to them. So we've created the service principal, the new service principal in the Cornell Heman side. Now we want to look at registering the enterprise application in the target Active Directory. It's quite simple. So we'll generate a link, and this is something you put in a link to click on your application, or you can mail it out to your client. But basically, we will provide the client ID, and we're going to ask for admin consent. And now what this does is the administrator of the Active Directory where we want to register the enterprise application, which is Cornell Training, or an administrator will click on this link. And when they click on this link, it will ask them to authorize this service principal that we created here. So let's have a look. Okay, so I'm Cornell at Cornell Training. And it says unverified because I don't have a URL that's bound to a domain, but for the moment we'll just accept it. So this will take a moment or two. At the same time now it's going to return to me a code, which I'm not really too worried about. But if I go back to the Active Directory here and I go to Enterprise Applications, I will see this Azure Demo Multi appear here. So it's not under app registration. So sorry, if I just go to Active Directory again and I go to app registrations, because this is the client's Active Directory, we're not going to be finding it here. So whether it's any of these things that I have here or not, but it's definitely going to be under the enterprise applications. And that means I've just now added this Azure Demo Multi to my Active Directory here. And this Azure Demo Multi, if you remember from the previous part of the video, what I'd like to do now is go to the Visual Studio Enterprise subscription, and I'm going to go to Access Control, and then I'm going to add a role. And I'm going to make it contributor, and I'm going to say Azure Demo, and we hopefully find Azure Demo Multi there. Click on it, save, and now I'm giving that enterprise application access to the subscription. Okay, so let's get a token. So what's quite important is we are going to be getting the token from the tenant or the Active Directory that controls the subscription. So it's quite important. So if I look at the two subscriptions or the two Active Directories, there's Cornell Training or Cornell Human, where we created the service principal, and then the enterprise application was created in Cornell Training, which is the target Active Directory. And when we are getting a token, we're going to be asking this tenant for the token, and because we've added the client ID and the client or the client into the enterprise applications, it'll recognize it. So let's just go to Postman and let's have a look at what we're going to be doing at this token endpoint. So here is the target Active Directory tenant ID, the client ID and client secret as it is defined in the service principal or the app registration. The scope is the same as before, default management at azure.com, and client credentials. And when I send it, it will create a new token for me. And then hopefully if I replace the token in here and I ask for a list of VMs, I am getting a error. So let's have a look at what the issue is. So the issue is that the subscription that I have in here is incorrect. So let's just have a look at what the subscription is on the Azure portal. And I can click on the subscription and I'm going to copy the subscription. And let's have a look if we get anything back now. Okay, and we are getting a result, but I don't have any virtual machines in the subscription. So the value is just empty, but it is working. So this kind of wraps up this set of videos around service principals, Azure Active Directory, and subscriptions on Azure and how to access resources. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe to the channel, click the like button, click the notification icon, and share it on social media. Thank you very much.